I'm $1 billion in debt.
You're $1 billion in debt. Well, let me just ask it straight. Why isn't this taught in schools?
You realise you're learning a whole lot of guff, absolutely, totally misleading nonsense about what are the real crises facing global economies, particularly the American economy. I want to go to one of the commonest fallacies that I see people fall for, which is the argument that if you borrow money from the bank, you borrow, say, $100, they charge you 10% interest, you've got to pay $110, you can't do it, so the debt has to increase all the time to enable you to be able to service the debt. That's a common fallacy that I see espoused on the internet all the time. So I'm going to illustrate what's behind that idea and show why it's wrong very quickly using this simple tool here.
The influential contrarian economist, Steve Keen.
Brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics.
The research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College in London.
He is someone that each and every one of us has to listen to, whether we agree or disagree.
Here's Steve Keen.
I'm going to talk about a different aspect of Ravel, which is capacity to monitor money. So the reason people have this panic attack in terms of not being able to repay private debt when you borrowed it is because they're not looking at the bank spending back in the opposite direction. It's that simple. So this is the tools here for setting up equations, defining the type of thing you define if you're doing system dynamics in general. But this little thing here is completely unique to Ravel, and that's what we call a Godley table. It's named after one of my favorite economists, Wynne Godley. What you do if you click on it, and this applies to all the tools in Ravel, click on it, you'll notice funny things stand up in the left-hand corner over there. As soon as I move the cursor onto the design canvas here, that object is attached to my mouse and I can click and place it there. Now that, it might look like a bank to you, I hope it does. That is an icon to integrate a bank. I'm going to call this a banking sector. This is actually, well, I'll call it just banks, plural of singular banks. So it's all the banks. And what it lets you do is just open it up here, and you're going to see how banks see the world, and they see it through the lens of double entry bookkeeping. They have assets, they have liabilities, and the difference between the two is their equity. And the same thing applies to you. If you have financial assets and financial liabilities, the difference between your financial assets and your financial liabilities is your net worth as well. So we're looking at debts, we're looking at loans, of course. That's called a debt, private debt in this case. And you then have deposits, then have the net worth of the banks is the difference between their assets and their liabilities. Of course, they've got more assets than just the debt the private sector owes. So then let's start with a simple model like that, where the private sector owes 100, that could be 100 million, 100 billion, 100 trillion, whatever figure you like working with, and it has deposits of 90. One little factor about private banking that most people don't treat seriously enough is that banks must have short-term financial assets that exceed their short-term financial liabilities. Otherwise, they are literally bankrupt. So you have to have a positive value there. I think it's a very simplified view, but I want to focus just on that fallacy that the level of debt must continue exploding because banks only lend you loans of, say, 100 billion. So you've got to pay interest of 10%. Where you find the other 10% from, you've got to borrow that from the bank and you get a runaway train. So what I'm going to have here is new debt, new borrowing. And the flow of new debt is called by accountants is called credit. So credit is the rate of change of debt. You borrow credit dollars per year from the banking sector, and that's fine by the bank so long as you also acknowledge your debt goes up by precisely the same amount. And what Ravel does with what we call a Godley table, which is unique, there's no software package like it anywhere else in the world, is that it makes sure the accounting is correct by saying the assets minus your liabilities are equal to your equity. Therefore, A, which is assets, minus L, which is liabilities, minus E must equal 0. If you type any operation on that you don't get a 0, you've made an accounting error. So this is a simple way to keep track of this particular issue, of all issues, in fact, about money. There's new borrowing, and then you've got to pay interest on outstanding debt, which, of course, is more than just your new debt. It's what you owed initially. And that's, of course, that's going to come out of your deposit account. So interest, you've got to make sure there's an orange box around the cell to know that it's actually entering there. So minus interest comes out of deposits. Now, at this stage, the Godley table is telling you you've got to have another entry that makes that 0. So, of course, you pay the interest to the banks. So now I've done that. I'm going to come back to the design canvas now and just take a look at it. Now, that's behind an icon. You can right-click and choose to put it in editor mode so you can actually see it on screen. So I'll do that here. And notice that the numbers are turning up this. When I define a dynamic model out of this, you're going to see those numbers change on the screen. Now, I know this is a very fast introduction, but I want to get to something else, which is all the paranoia I'm seeing over government debt turning up on the internet right now, and I'm going to make a comment upon that in the next video. What I want to now do is take these elements, so credit and interest, and place them on the design canvas. And the way that we do that at the moment with Ravel, we probably improve this at some time. There's a little button here called var for variable, and that brings up another set of menus where you can create a variable, create a constant, create a parameter, or browse your current variables. So I'm going to bring up the browser window here, and I'm going to put credit and interest and deposits and debt on the canvas to begin with. So if you're paying interest on debt, of course, that's going to be the amount of money you owe times the interest rate. Now, I haven't got interest rate there, so I'm just going to type the word INT and then underscore and curly brackets RATE, because that tells Ravel to subscript everything. So I type OK on that, and I'm going to make that a parameter, and I'm going to give it a value of 0 initially, just to show what can be done with the program, and a maximum value of 0.2, which is 20%, minimum value of 0, and a step size of 0.01, which is 1%. So I've done that. And now what I've got is int rate, and if I multiply int rate by debt, I'm going to work out what the interest payments are. So I type a multiply key. You can type directly onto the canvas in Ravel. You don't need to point up at menus to get things like multiply keys and so on added in. And the way you define an equation is by dragging arrows out of the little circle box that turns up when you're hovering over an object. So if you click here, you're going to drag the object around. Click here, you're going to drag an arrow out so you can define something else. So now I've got debt multiplied by the interest rate equals interest. And of course, if a bank charged you 0 interest, you'd have no problem at all. I'll bring the browser back up, and I'm going to include the bank's net worth here. So that's the first issue that I want to take a look at. But deposits and the amount of money in the bank's system, and I can now bring down it. You make charts larger by stretching the little arrow in the corner there. And I'm going to have deposits as one of the inputs to this graph and banks the other. I'm now going to put a legend on here, so that I'm talking about. I'll call this bank accounts. And on the horizontal axis, we have time. So let's just call that years. And then what we've got in your bank account is dollars. Okay, it's the dollars you owe. Click on OK. And now if I run this, of course, nothing's going to happen because I've got 0 interest going on. So I run the program and they both stay at the same level. Now, of course, in the real world, you pay interest. So notice I've got the little slider down there, a little dot there. I can move that by pressing the up or down arrow. So I press the up arrow, it goes up by the step size I've defined. Let's say we've got 5% interest. Click on OK. And sure enough, what everybody worries about happens. The deposits head towards 0. You can see what's happening here. Bank heads towards everything. You're bankrupt. What can you do? It's a slight problem. What's been left out of this vision of why you end up in catastrophe if you borrow money at all, there's money flowing into the banks, but no money flowing out. Now, I know banks are stingy, and I know they take a long time to spend, but they still do. So the model's not complete. What I've got to include here is bank spending. And that's going to be money coming out of the bank's short-term equity, which is equivalent to its deposit account with itself in that case. So let's call this spend, call it spending. That flows into the bank accounts of the private sector. Now, I don't need to define that, so let's just bring the browser window back again and take spending here. And I'm going to relate that to the amount of money in the bank's account. So I can take a copy of bank here and say that there's a spend rate by bank. So I'm going to be quite verbose and type bank spend superscript, which is the little caret. And let's say banks spend pretty slowly. So they spend, say, 10% of the amount of money in their accounts in any 1 year. So I'm going to make this another parameter and give it a value of 0.1, which is they spend 10% of their equity every year. Maximum of, say, 0.5. Minimum, let's make it really small, 0.01, and a step size of 1. So this is now going to be a little parameter. I multiply the bank spend rate by the amount of money in the bank's account. Then I get the amount of spending. And if you do it initially, you've got 10 in the equity of the banks. The spend rate, as you can see there, is 10%. They're going to spend $1 per year, million, 1 billion, and so on. So I hit the run on that and watch what happens. Same thing seems to be occurring, but it's tapering. The reason it's tapering is that slowly but surely, even though the level of spending is slow, the amount of money flowing into the banks remains constant because the debt's still 100, but the spending rate increases because there's more and more money in the bank's account, and the amount they're spending tends to be 10% of the total, which is heading towards 50. So when you hit 50, the level stabilizes. So that the reason people have this panic attack in terms of not being able to repay private debt when you borrowed it is because they're not looking at the bank spending back in the opposite direction. It's that simple. Having spent 20 years of my life working in the computer industry, I regarded this as a very old-fashioned and kludgy user interface. So if I take a look at the one for a fraction of agriculture, they're all checks-written equations, very much like what you put in a standard computer modeling program, putting in Python or that sort of thing. So I never particularly, even though I liked the concept, I never liked the technology that was used to do system dynamics. Now, that's a simple illustration of several things. First of all, it's what's unique about Ravel. There is no other program that has a tool like the Godly table. Secondly, you're actually designing differential equations here. Now, it's not obvious. All you've done is type entries inside these columns here, and that's simply double entry bookkeeping. It takes a while to get familiar with it, as familiar as I am, but that's all you're doing is typing entries in flow cells. What the program is doing in the background is creating differential equations out of that. So now it's saying the rate of change of deposits is credit, new money being created, plus spending by the banks minus interest, and the rate of change of the bank's account is interest minus spending. And that's all been simulated for you in the program. If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to apply.stevekeinfree.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to apply.stevekeinfree.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.